So, did you guys consider that sequence to be a cinematic sequence? Question number 2, maybe the more important question, what the hell is cinematic? Yo guys, what is going on? Jake Felzine here. Been a while since we've done kind of a talking heads video like this, but I wanted to do it this week. In fact, I haven't had as much fun with these recently, which is why I've kind of been getting a little more crazy or creative with kind of some of my video formats, but the creative one is coming this weekend. I've got kind of my work cut out for me, but I wanted to make this video because I think it's very important, and it all stems from the fact that this weekend, me and my dad are going backpacking for the second time. It's another one of our backpacking trips. We went for the first time, or at least I went for the first time, and well, no, it was his first time this year too, this year, and we're going again. We had so much fun doing it. There's just something epic about sleeping under the stars with no one around, waking up for epic sunrises and, killer sunsets. It's kind of like my new dream hobby. I can't believe I hadn't gotten into it earlier. But anyway, the important takeaway from that is that'll be the next video. And it kind of drove this week's video because I said something really dumb to myself. I was getting ready and thinking through, okay, what do I want to bring on this trip for photo and video gear? Last time I brought the A7 III with the Tamron 28-75, and it was a great camera for pictures and video, but I started to think about it and I thought, you know what? It would be really cool to bring my GH5S on this trip. I'll set that down so it's not making noise. For the smaller lenses and the smaller form factor, be able to bring more reach in the kind of shots that I could get, and not have to bring a bunch of heavy lenses. I could bring a lot of my small micro 4/3 lenses. So as soon as I was kind of thinking this, then I said something really dumb to myself, which was, oh, I don't really want to bring that camera because I just don't think the footage is as cinematic. So then naturally I got to thinking and I was like, well, gosh, what even is cinematic? It's the most overused word on the internet in the filmmaking niche. What if we sat down today and defined it and really thought through, can I get cinematic shots with my GH5S? And to cut to the chase, the answer is absolutely. So today, let's break down what is cinematic. Guys, I think there are a couple of things that make up a cinematic image. Actually, I think there's a lot of things. And really, at the heart of it, I think the internet uses cinematic very much interchangeably with beautiful or good. An image is cinematic, that means it looks really nice, right? If it looks cinematic, it looks like a movie. Hollywood has all of the budget, the big cameras, the big sets. They make the best looking images. Therefore, all of us with our more budget-friendly options are trying to get there without spending nearly as much money. So I think the first one to break down when it comes to a cinematic image is on the camera side, and that is dynamic range. Dynamic range is pretty much dependent on the camera itself. Can it shoot a log format? Is it able to capture a wide range of essentially luminance values in the image to create a very soft rolling, gradually changing, low contrast image? And the reason this looks so good is it essentially is trying to get as close to what our human eyes perceive. We don't typically have ridiculously blown out white skies and really dark shadows. So if we can get cameras that can look and see that, it looks more good to or natural to our human eyes. So dynamic range is really determined mostly by the camera, but of course like lighting can kind of help it, right? If you have a shot where you need a little bit more light in the shadows, you can of course add it with lights. Dynamic range kind of can be affected with lighting, but we'll talk more about lighting in the next couple of subjects. So dynamic range is huge. Hollywood is using $50,000, $60,000, $100,000 cameras. Therefore, they are getting some of the best dynamic range in the world when it comes to their cinematic images. But of course, even at the consumer level, the GH5S, the A7 III, the Blackmagic Pocket 4K all have incredibly commendable dynamic range values and honestly can look very cinematic if you give them a good cinematic image to shoot. I think that's the first big one, is dynamic range. Let's talk about the second one, and this is an internet fad for the centuries, and that is bokeh. For some reason, and I think that it's just because it looks cool, and I'm totally guilty of this, I think bokeh is awesome. It looks great. You know, I love using it, but for some reason, I think on the internet, bokeh is generally associated with a very cinematic image. Now, how much this one really matters, I think is actually kind of silly. I think bokeh can be a very effective tool. It draws your focus to a subject which is very cinematic because, as we'll talk about a lot in this video, drawing intent from your viewers drives story, which story ultimately makes for the most cinematic of videos because regardless of how good it looks, there needs to be some substance as well as it needs to look good. I think bokeh is really good and important for this, but I would urge you, next time you're watching a movie, how much bokeh is really used. I think you'll be a little bit surprised to find that bokeh isn't quite as rampant in the cinema world in Hollywood because, again, they're focus pulling. They can't have razor thin focuses or they're going to miss focus on their subjects or it's going to be incredibly hard. And they do other techniques to really draw us into a cinematic image without necessarily having just obliterated backgrounds. So this is a big internet topic. And again, I don't think that it holds much merit. I think it can help make an image look cinematic, but of the ones we're going to talk about today, I think this is the least important one, which was a big reason why I was questioning the GH5S, which again, we'll get back to that in a second. Another big internet fad, you've seen it before, the epic cinematic handheld B-roll sequences. I've done a few myself. These are all over the internet, guys, and they are very much associated with cool choreography and cool slow motion. Now again, this one is a little bit like bokeh. I don't think that slow motion is inherently cinematic. I think it can be. I think those sequences are very cinematic and I think they look very cool, right? So yes, those sequences are very cinematic, but in Hollywood, you usually don't see much slow motion. In fact, my favorite movie star of all time, The Dark Knight, I've mentioned it many times. I love the beginning of that movie, guys. It is phenomenal. There's not a lick of slow motion in that entire intro, and yet the suspense is there, the drama is there, the intent is there, but we don't need slow motion to really make it epic or cinematic. So it is a cool technique. It can be very good in a cinematic setting, but it doesn't necessarily mean your image is going to be more cinematic just because there's slow motion. So the last two were kind of the internet fads, but again, not saying that they aren't cinematic, just saying I wouldn't put as much weight on them as you might think. I think really the most important ones that I'm about to talk about are lighting, color, different focal lengths, and not overexposing your highlights. In my opinion, these four, with dynamic range somewhat, are the best way that you on a budget can control how good or cinematic your image looks. Focus on your lighting, guys. I say this all the time, and it's funny because I just ordered a brand new camera. I pre-ordered the A7S III, but frankly, I'm almost debating canceling that pre-order because I realized $3,500 could buy me a ton of really good lights. I use this super cheap light here, and the one behind me is ridiculously cheap. I have terrible lights, but they're better than nothing, and I think they work really well, so I haven't bought new lights, but I'm really wondering if I need to get the new camera. Lighting and knowing how to light a scene can make an image look very cinematic. And it's the same reason that Sam Kolder almost always shoots his videos at sunrise and sunset, or most people try to shoot on overcast days. The lighting just enhances the image, and inherently a soft lit cloudy day, a soft lit sunset looks much better and more pleasing to our eyes than bright, harsh, high noon, Idaho summer days that frankly just don't look that good. So lighting is a big one, guys. Always recommend focusing on your lighting. Pay attention to what time of day you're shooting. I think it makes a huge difference. Okay, so now let's touch on color. Color is very subjective. I think the general rule of thumb that I always tell people, and I would encourage you guys to do this, is bring in your significant other or a close family member or someone who isn't really in tune with video and ask them to come watch your footage. and say to look critically at the image. If they say anything about the colors, that probably means you're doing the color wrong. Now, again, I think a general rule of thumb is that color doesn't have to look perfectly accurate, but it needs to not detract from the story. Very orange skin could work in a desert situation, but if that fits the scene or the mood, that person who doesn't know anything about color grading is going to come in and say, yeah, that looked great. I thought that looked really cool. And you've done your job. A good color grade does not take away from the story. So I would definitely say try that technique, focus on that, and that will definitely make your image more cinematic as far as color is concerned. Okay, now let's talk about different focal lengths. This one I really believe in as well. This focal length kind of sucks for cinematic because if you look at this looks very similar to maybe something like what your cell phone would shoot. I would say in general, different focal lengths drive us to really feel more immersed in the film. These could be longer focal lengths, these could be very wide focal lengths, but typically on the wider end, it starts to look more like a cell phone. So I definitely would recommend to maybe try some different focal lengths, 30, 50, maybe even get out to like the 80 millimeter full frame equivalent and really see if that can enhance your story and drive more intent towards a more cinematic image. Watching a lot of movies recently, it's become really obvious to me that movies use pretty long focal lengths, not always super long, but they're definitely using 50 to 85, that range to 100 pretty frequently, and it looks very good because it really immerses us into what is taking place. And guys, the last of these 4 that I wanted to talk about, overexposing your highlights is a big no-no. Keep those highlights exposed properly. I don't know if this is just my personal preference, but I think a lot of people share this as well. If you can keep your skies from being blown out, white, just ugly, harsh light, and, introduce more shadows into your image, I think we as humans are much more forgiving for how that image looks versus an image with, raised shadows and really bright highlights. I don't know why this is. I would love to maybe understand the science a little bit deeper, but it's very clear that we are more forgiving of shadowy images because it seems to look more natural. So I always tell people this is a great trick. If you've got more consumer-friendly budget cameras, expose for those highlights, try to keep as much detail in the clouds, in the sky as possible, and it's just gonna look a lot more natural. And time for a bonus honorable mention one, guys. The biggest one, and this is probably one of my favorites, sound design. Good sound design can make any video very cinematic, which is funny because when we think about a cinematic image, we often forget about the most important part, which is what are we listening to? If you can improve your sound design, it makes a huge difference in the overall cinematic or good lookingness of your image because again, it's more immersive, it drives intent, which drives story. All right, guys, so like I mentioned, I was talking about the GH5S, I was talking about my backpacking trip. Let's round this up. Based on all of these categories that we just talked about, should I not bring my GH5S on my backpacking trip? And the answer is most definitely, I was being completely stupid when I said, I don't think the GH5S can get a cinematic image. Sure, it has a smaller sensor. Sure, it's harder to get that ridiculous bokeh, but as far as color goes, as far as dynamic range, packability, ability to use it as a cinematographer and video maker myself, that's all there. It doesn't matter which camera I'm using, whether it's the A7 III, the GH5S, or the Blackmagic. All of these topics that we just talked about can be greatly influenced by my ability as a filmer to get a good looking cinematic image. So guys, based on this criteria that we just talked about, it's so obvious this weekend, if I want to save a little bit of weight in my backpack, it makes sense to bring my Micro Four Thirds system, and I'm still going to get a very cinematic result for whatever kind of video I'm hoping to make from this trip. So don't let everyone fool you. Full frame is amazing. I love it. I think it's fantastic, but it is definitely wrong to assume that you can't get incredible looking cinematic images from a smaller sensor. That's just not true. One of my favorite overarching rule of thumb statements is that a good scene with a bad camera is still going to create a great image, whereas a bad scene with a good camera is still going to make a bad image. If you know what you're doing, if you know what to feed the camera, as long as it looks good, almost regardless of what kind of camera you're using, the fact of the matter is that a good scene is going to make for a kick-ass looking image. But anyway, I have rambled on way too freaking long. Hope you guys liked this video. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe so that you can catch my cinematic edit of my backpacking trip coming up. Very excited for that. But anyway, guys, take care, take it easy, be safe, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.